Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I guess it's the moment of truth on my most recent attempt at trying to control the mites in my African nightcrawler bins. I'll start opening up things here and I'll try to provide a little context into what I'm talking about here in case you're new. For quite a while, possibly months now, I think 3 or more months at this point, I've been observing mites in my bins. And I think the most severe instance of that I've seen is in my African nightcrawler systems. And of my two African nightcrawler systems, this here is the older of the two. I had actually come into here to recruit some worms with which to launch off another system. We're going to check that one as well. And before coming down here, I actually went into my older videos, pretty much spot checking every single video going back months and months, even to the point where I checked that very first video where I was launching the African nightcrawlers that I moved from here into that new bin, the first feeding of that new bin, and subsequent feedings to see if I can try to see when these little tiny white mites that you could see everywhere first started showing up on the scene. I didn't really pay it much attention. I did pretty much acknowledge their presence every time I saw them, I think. And then it must have been maybe a month and a half ago when I started to think that I should really make at least an attempt at reducing their numbers if I can. So I first started by trying to take certain steps that I thought were the right steps to try to get the mite numbers down. Started out by trying to just leave the covers off the systems to let them air out and dry off a little bit, because I believe that mites really thrive in a nice damp environment. And I first started trying that to see if it might help. After that, I've taken numerous steps. So that was step number one, the whole drying thing. And then the next thing I tried to do, since the other thing that seems to cause outbreaks of mites is a plentiful amount of food, or maybe a surplus of food. So the next thing I tried doing was kind of withholding feedings from these systems for a little while. And I think I let the systems go for, a good number of weeks without any food in them. So at this point I was kind of starving the systems and drying the systems, trying to reduce the numbers of these little tiny white mites. Finally, I even got to the point where I was thinking that maybe it was something to do with the pH level, because a more acidic system is where you might often find an outbreak. So I actually bought home some crushed dolomite from the home improvement store, only to find that I already had some here at home already. To see if I can mix some of that stuff into here and into the other system to try to reduce the numbers of mites. And most recently, one of my viewers suggested that he had kind of stumbled on what might be a possible solution. And I think later on it did turn out that he was finding that his results were pertaining to a slightly different type of a mite. So it might not really be apples and apples here, but I figured I would try to give it a go and see if what he had noticed would work here. And what he had noticed was that he had taken some paper towel on which he had dried off some bacon after preparing a meal, and that bacon grease soaked piece of paper towel ended up in his worm bin, and then within a day or two he had found that the paper towel had been pretty much mobbed with mites. So I figured I'd give that a try, so I grabbed a couple pieces of paper towel. This is one of them right here, and I bought down a little bit of bacon grease and soaked the paper in bacon grease to see if it might become an attractant that might draw in the mites. And if it did work, then I would just, grab the collected mites, paper and all, and then simply trash it. And this here is where I had kind of thought I would find tons and tons of mites, but I'm noticing them more on the material right under the paper and actually on this coffee filter that was resting right on top of the paper. And it makes me question whether this particular type of mite is really interested in the bacon grease or not. It might not actually be what's drawing them. I'm starting to think that at this point, maybe what's drawing them is the fact that I had put the plastic coverings back on here to not allow for ongoing evaporation of the moisture in the bin. And maybe the mites are actually coming up to take advantage of the increased moisture. Because for a while I was allowing things to get fairly dry in here. So maybe they were starting to feel a little bit of distress from the dryness, and they're coming up here for some relief. But I'm a little bit confused as to what to do next, you know. I was even thinking that, you know, hey, if I find this or if I find that, then what do I do? But based on what I'm seeing here, I'm starting to, I guess, establish the theory that maybe the bacon grease is not the answer here, although on a piece of white paper, it's really difficult to tell if it's white mites that are on there or something else. I mean, it did seem to me like there was something else kind of on here, but I can't tell what it is. And even if it is mites, it doesn't seem like it's significantly more than what I see elsewhere, just in general out on this paper here, or on these few pieces of food scrap up here on the top surface. What I had done here, this was set up 2 days ago, by the way. What I had done here was I had just cherry-picked some of the items in the bin that I had located, which did appear to have the highest concentration of mites on them, and I simply positioned them up near the top of the material up here to hopefully put them in close proximity to what I had hoped would become sort of the attractant, which was the grease on that piece of paper there. But now I'm questioning whether it was the grease that brought them up or really just the recirculating moisture that that the plastic caused. So I was kind of kicking around some ideas. You know, one idea was to simply come down here with just some more grease and replenish the supply if I was getting the feeling that that was really the one thing that might be what's drawing them up. But I'm really skeptical as to whether that's what's working to round up the mites at this point. I believe I'm more inclined to think that it's the moisture that's collecting on the plastic that was covering things up here, and that's what they're coming for. I mean, we'll just go back over here to some of these pieces of paper that had been placed right beneath that piece of plastic we took off in the beginning. You'll remember first thing that came off was the plastic, and right under the plastic was these sheets of newspaper. And on here too, you could see lots and lots of little tiny white dots, all mites. But it was this piece of paper here right beneath this one that seemed to have the greatest number of mites on it. And a lot of people have been questioning, well, why don't you just take out those things that you're finding to have a lot of mites on them rather than leaving them in there? And I believe that that's exactly what I'm going to do at this point. I've always just figured I would put them back in there, and I didn't think that removing bits and pieces of stuff would, you know, have any sort of significant effect. But at this point, I'm wondering if that might just be the easiest way, is to continue luring them with moisture. And then after I do round up a certain amount of them, just extracting whatever that item is that they've come up to congregate on to take advantage of the moisture. And repeat, you know, just do that a few times over to see if I can come up with some sort of a positive effect here. So that's kind of what I'm doing now. I've just, you know, taken those few little food scraps that seem to have good numbers of mites on them, as well as that coffee filter that was on here. As far as these two pieces of paper, These just don't really seem to be quite as mobbed with mites as the coffee filter was. So I'm just going to go ahead and assume that this is not what they're quite as interested in, but rather the more damp piece of paper that was right beneath them. So we're going to, I think, yeah, you know, it's coming back to me now. The one thing I did do was I did dampen that that piece of coffee filter before putting it in here. And then I placed the plastic cover on top so as to not allow it to dry off. So maybe that is the trick. Maybe I just need to put a really damp something in here that might draw the mites onto it, and let's see if that really becomes the item that most readily attracts them, so that they could just be extracted. So, you know, I appreciate all the feedback I've received on this topic from all the different viewers. It's always interesting to hear all the different stories. I think one of the more interesting stories I heard about was somebody who had actually, I think, maybe even sent samples or sent photographs or something, got an expert to help identify the types of mites. And then the expert actually provided a solution that said, well, what you need to do is introduce, I believe, some sort of a predatory mite, which would go in there and wipe out all of the other invasive mites. And then once the food supply for the predatory mites was exhausted, you know, so basically after they've already killed off all of the other pesky mites, their numbers ultimately dropped off too, because what they were preying on had been depleted. Seems like such an elegant and simple solution. And I don't know all the details. I don't think there was a lot of detail provided in terms of what types of mites were used for that and stuff like that, but I could certainly look into it further, and I'm wondering if that might be the only way to deal with it. You know, but I've also always tried to really limit the amount of money I spend on doing this stuff, because I really want what I'm doing here to be adoptable by anybody, you know, regardless of their budget. And, you know, if you've got an unlimited budget and you can throw money at your hobby left and right, then that's fine and that's great. But I'd also like for this to be something that could appeal to pretty much anybody or everybody. So I always attempt to try to seek solutions that have no, or at least a minimal price tag associated to them. So while it sounds great to involve experts and purchase things and stuff like that, I'd almost rather just prefer to come up with a solution that's a little bit more grassroots, a little bit more homespun, and I just believe that that would be a little bit more, you know, relatable to a greater audience. Okay, so I just looked over here and I noticed that I had a coffee filter resting here on my bench, one that I thought I might use in another setup somewhere. Oh, I remember, I think I was building a new bin yesterday, and all I really wanted to do was use the coffee in here to set that new bin up, and I was left with the filter. So the same as we did previously, we're just going to use a piece of coffee filter again. A nice and damp one again. The only difference here is it's not a round one, it's a cone-shaped one that we're going to split in half. We'll save the other half for the other system that needs this same treatment. And I believe what I'm going to do is I'm just going to try to continue with what appears to have worked here, which is not trying to bait them out with bacon grease, but rather trying to bait them out with moisture. And now the only other thing I was thinking was, rather than having moisture across the entire top of the bin the way we were doing here previously, if I can come up with a way to just focus the moisture recirculation to only the place where I want the mites to congregate, then we might, you know, see fewer mites all over the place, and maybe more isolated to the place where I want them to be. So I was even thinking maybe allowing these pieces of paper to remain outboard of where we're trying to get the mites to come over to. So I would just position these out further on the edge. I guess just to try to limit the ongoing evaporation of the material in the bin, because I believe that the material in the bin is already at the point where I wouldn't want it to dry too much more, because it is kind of dry. But I believe it still has enough moisture content that it would want to try to evaporate. So I've got a couple of these plastic tops, and I thought that maybe if we put the dampened piece of paper here and then just a very isolated sort of plastic covering over only there, then we could try to focus where we're trying to attract the mites to, so that in the end all we're doing is extracting that dampened piece of paper and repeating as needed until we, hopefully get to a point where we've reduced the number of mites without, allowing the bin to get dangerously too dry and make it into a place that the worms don't even want to be. So let's give that a try. All right. Totally winging it, right? I'm wondering if we sort of maybe even double it up a little bit. Focus it even further. Like so. I don't know if it makes a whole lot of difference. And then I'm just positioning it like so. I don't know. Will it work? I do not know. I've got a feeling it might dry out a little bit. My hope is that that plastic will actually provide enough recirculation to, let's place it lower so it's actually resting not on the newspaper but rather on the surface of the material in the bin. And then these pieces of paper could just rest on top. Because I don't want to have a lot of airflow coming in this side. I really want this to become sort of like a terrarium. So the next time I check in here, this should hopefully be just fogged over from the condensation that's trying to evaporate but gets caught there. And then hopefully it keeps that piece of paper right beneath it nice and damp. All right, making it up as I go along. What else is new? All right, I'm going to go ahead and move this thing off the bench, get the other system, the other African nightcrawler system, and we're going to give it the same treatment. And then we're going to keep our fingers crossed. All right, so now this one is, it's going to be set up very much the same, because I was really just pretty much repeating the same tactic in both cases. The only real difference, I think, is that this is not 2 sheets of paper covering the top, but only one. But it is pretty tattered and torn up. So even if it is just one piece, maybe we could just tear it in half so that we can sort of separate it and cover on 2 edges. Like so. You can see everywhere there's moisture, there's mites. Out here where it's damp, out here where it's dry, you don't see much action, but here towards the center there's definitely a good number of mites hanging out. These poor sheets of paper are really pretty much toast. But we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to set these pieces of paper off to the side, and I don't know, I'm questioning whether these might be best removed too, because they do have a good number of mites on them. I don't know. If I had other pieces of paper handy to cover up with in the place of these, I would use them, but I don't. I've got to get my hands on some more newspaper one of these days. So I think we'll just accept the fact that this piece of paper here is where the majority of the mites are. So we'll just evict the worms that are hanging out here. so we can trash the paper along with the mites that have gathered on it. And you can see there's a whole lot of them on here. Let's just rest it here for a moment so we could take a closer look at what we've got going on. I think if we just play the video back quickly, we'll be able to better see what's going on here. Because I am interested in seeing what's on this white paper, but I believe that since the paper is pretty much the same color as the mites, it's almost impossible to see what the heck is going on here. So I'm going to let this run for a moment just so we can play it back quickly to see if what's on here is actually mites or what. And then I'll know what I've thrown away. But either way, I'm throwing that away too. And then we'll restore with some moisture. So let's see what we've got. Alright, so I took the time while we were allowing the video to roll. I took that piece of paper that we're going to be using for this, and I went back to the piece of plastic as well as those materials that we extracted from this container to try to rescue some of the little worms that were hanging out. And I had dampened the paper to make it into a little bit of a relief for them, because even after only about 10 minutes I could feel significant dryness starting to set in. So I wanted to dampen the paper to make it a little bit more comfortable for them. So these mite infested pieces of damp paper are coming out. And I think we're just gonna do what we did in the other bin. I'm gonna bring these worms back in, and we'll moisten this piece of paper as much as we can. And then we'll go ahead and set up this little terrarium environment down here in such a way that hopefully it does actually become sort of a moisture lock, vapor barrier, if you will, and hopefully things stay nice and damp right there underneath that piece of plastic. The rest will continue to dry out a little bit, but my hope is that right there, that piece of wet paper is going to be what helps us round up as many mites as we can out of these systems. So the saga continues after many months now. So all I could do is continue to keep my fingers crossed and hope for the types of results that I'm hoping to see. Who knows what will become of it, but yeah, I'd love to see their numbers reduced. I guess once I get done here, besides cleaning up and putting things away, I'm also going to have to get rid of the those pieces of paper that we extracted and those food chunks that we extracted that have mites all over them. I'm actually thinking of just putting them out in the snow, and I'm hoping that maybe that'll just knock them all out, and then I could take all those materials after the insects have perished. I could just throw those into my outside composting system. So that's my plan. And as you can tell, I'm often just making up my game plan as I go along, as I did here today, kind of. I did actually think about it a little bit ahead of time, and I thought to myself, well, what do I do if this is happening, or what do I do if that's happening? But I'm definitely curious to see what we see in the video played back quickly, because I am curious to see if the bacon soaked, or the bacon grease soaked piece of paper was actually doing anything. But I was just starting to get the sense that it was really the moisture that was drawing the mites, not so much the grease. All right, we'll see when we play the video back quickly. And if it did turn out that the grease was really what was working, then I could always try to do that again. I've got more bacon grease. I've got, you know, that option to restore that baiting attempt again and see what happens. So that's it for today, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. And in this case, leave me a fingers crossed too. Hopefully this works. And if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.